China and the U.S. have been trading punches over trade for months. As the world's two largest economies engaged in a new round of tit-for-tat tariff exchanges, the odds of a quick settlement are fading. So will this escalation plunge the prospect of a continued trade negotiations into doubt? What do we make of the ban on Huawei? What's a very real possibility between China and the U.S.? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Thomas Patrick Gale, Executive Director of Lehman Bush, and Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We shall also cross over to Bob Cab, Director of the Economist Corporate Network in Hong Kong via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. First of all, gentlemen, what do you make of the latest phone call that Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi had with Mr. Pompeo, Secretary of State?
Well, I think that it shows that we are having discussions at the highest level, and I think that's important. So regardless of the slowdown in the communication overall, we know it's still going on behind the doors, but to publicly have some of our two most senior advisors in each country to be talking publicly, I think is a very good sign.
Zhao, you know, I'm a bit surprised, honestly, with the phone call between the two foreign ministers. In fact, to my knowledge, all the senior official contacts between the two governments have been actually suspended since the launch of the trade disputes or trade wars, if you like. What do you make of the latest resumptions of the contacts between the two foreign ministers?
Actually, I see this as a complaint from the Chinese side to the U.S. and taking the issue of Huawei to Secretary Pompeo and saying basically the U.S. is violating international norms and also attacking a single Chinese company with American executive power. That shouldn't be done. It's harmful to the negotiations and setting further barriers of resuming the negotiations. And I think in the phone call, Chinese side made it very clear that the negotiation is the only solution to the current trade problem, and the U.S. shouldn't continue to use this maximum pressure tactic to press China, because China won't accept that.
Thomas, should there be a ring of truth in what Dr. Zhao Hai says about the phone call? Do you think the deal with Huawei or the deal between the United States and China about Huawei is actually politically motivated?
I think, of course, it's politically motivated, as most things generally are. It is a substantial economic factor for the United States. I think that they acknowledge they're behind in the technology. To me, it may just be a slowing down of Huawei in their ability to move forward on it. I think that there are some serious security issues that the U.S. brings up, but from my reading of the different areas, Huawei has responded to that, I think, very strongly. And I'm glad that China today, again, said that they will go to the courts to be able to press their issue on it, because that, again, shows the country is becoming a country of laws and not just administrative orders. So that, again, I think is a very good sign for the process and where China and the United States can end up on the issue.
From the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, in that case, President Donald Trump said in his tweet that he could exercise some political influence if necessary to win early release of Meng Wanzhou if China could make easier concessions on the. Now, this is obviously, as Patrick made it very clear, political motivation. Do you think the Chinese government should also throw its weight behind Huawei to support Huawei? On the other hand, ironically, Mr. Ren Zhengfei, Founding Technologies Corporation Limited, said he would be very cautious about having a close relationship with the government. He had been very clearly aware of the danger that a close relationship with the Chinese government would provide the U.S. government and its American competitors with more live ammunition against Huawei. So what do you think of the current pros and cons concerning the caution of Huawei?
Well, first of all, I want to make clear that the U.S. side at least claim that the Huawei case is a legal case, and also using American domestic law trying to punish Huawei. For instance, the request for Canada to extradite Meng Wanzhou. But on the other hand, from today's news, the U.S. is actually accusing Huawei of probably threatening U.S. national security. However, the U.S. never presented any evidence to support their claim. Therefore, I think it's right for the Chinese government to support Huawei challenging U.S. government decisions in U.S. court. So overall, I think this is very politicized, but at the same time, because of the timing, it's very clear that the Trump administration is thinking about using Huawei as a chip against China in this trade war. So I think at the end of the day, in order to resolve this problem, first of all, the two sides need to come back to the negotiation table, and also the U.S. shouldn't exclude Huawei from the talking of these negotiations, and Huawei should be included and should be resolved at the same time, because it's already been politicized, not as the other side claimed.
Thomas, given the apparent overtones of a Cold War, a haunting specter looming larger on the horizon, what do you think of the possibility that the European Union would take side with the United States after President Emmanuel Macron and a strong voice from Germany, which said, they both said Europeans would not automatically take side with the United States in safeguarding their national interests by excluding Huawei from the construction of a telecommunication infrastructure in Europe? Does it mean that a coalition of willing won't be easily formed in favor of the U.S. On the issue of Huawei?
I think, again, that Huawei, through their technology advancement, has really created a threat to a lot of different countries because they're leapfrogging a lot of the technology on an excellent technology. So I think that many countries are knee-jerk reacting against that. Not because there may be true security interests, but as I say, it may be economically motivated as well as politically. So I think on a lot of the politics make strange bedfellows, so we're not sure where exactly the things will come down as the leadership in the EU solidifies and moves towards the next level.
Pretty soon, President Xi Jinping will meet with his American counterpart on the sidelines of the G20 in Japan. What kind of deliverables do you expect from the summit, an informal one between these two heads of state? Zhao?
I think under the current circumstances, it's very hard to expect anything, or even that talk would happen. I mean, the U.S. side has already said they want that talk. However, Chinese side, at least from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, never said that this talk would happen. So I think before the G20 meeting, the sideline meetings between the two top leaders, at least the U.S. side should need to show their goodwill gesture that they really want to negotiate and settle the trade issue with China. Otherwise, I mean, even if the two top leaders meet, what are they going to talk about? So I think there needs some under-the-table negotiations and communications first to achieve certain level of common understanding, and then they can proceed with the talk at the G20. And then if that's successful, we can expect that they probably will resume the talk. We can't expect a final deal at that moment, but at least they will postpone the further adding of tariffs over each other, and then they can give them more time and space to further negotiate a successful deal.
Obviously, neither side wants to be viewed as the first to blink in the standoff. Thomas, the Chinese authorities made it very clear that we don't want any additional tariffs to be imposed on Chinese exports. Now, President Trump moved to impose billions of dollars in new tariffs on Chinese goods and threatened to slap on even more as early as late June. Do you think there's any margin for the Americans to make any compromise to make the issue more flexible so that the two heads of state could reach some kind of conclusion and lay the groundwork for the 12th round of trade talks to happen in Beijing?
I believe so. I believe that, as we know, President Trump is a showman, so he likes to do dramatic episodes to be able to draw people's attention to a specific topic. He's obviously not trained as a politician. He's trained as a business person and uses a different set of metrics for the way that he's dealing with the politics on the international level. I think, though, President Xi and President Trump do have quite a bit of mutual respect for one another. I think their original meetings were very harmonious. They introduced their families to one another. I think President Trump perhaps was the most Chinese of of any recent American president on how to receive the Chinese dignitaries. So I think that that underlying respect and trust will break through the dramatic scenes of the tariffs, the tit-for-tat, to be able to make some progress. I do hope, regardless of what goes on in the interim, that the two do meet in Japan, because I think it is important, and I think that that's the only way for us to make progress, and I really believe both sides know that.
What you say, Thomas, reminds me of what happened exactly 30 years ago after the tragic incident in Beijing. Late senior leader Deng Xiaoping said to his American counterpart, George W. Bush, the American president, that whatever happened between our two countries, our personal relationship should be very important in shaping the future of this bilateral relationship. Let me cross over to Robert Kapp, who's standing by in Hong Kong. Hello, Robert. Sorry for keeping you waiting, but you've been hearing our discussion in the Beijing studio. What do you make of the crippling blow that the U.S. government levels against Huawei in the latest development?
Well, I think the move that's been made here isn't necessarily against Huawei specifically, although that's obviously the target and that's where the pain will be most directly felt. But it's actually in terms of U.S. concerns about cybersecurity and ongoing allegations from the U.S. side about continual hacking. And this is aggressive hacking. It's not just kind of malicious or, how should I say, necessarily only economically related hacking. It gets into all sorts of levels of U.S. national security, military installations and the like. So although Huawei hasn't been alleged to be sponsoring that, I think it's an easy target to start with, and that's probably the bigger game here. The U.S. wants to have some ratcheting down of what it sees as a very direct cybersecurity threat from China.
Robert, what do you make of the negative and broad impact arising from this latest ban on Huawei by the U.S. government? What does that mean for the overseas sales of Huawei products in, for example, Europe, Africa, and other developing countries? Because overseas sales of Huawei account for a big chunk of its global business.
Yeah, I think in terms of some of the markets you mentioned, like developing markets such as Africa, Latin America, the fact that Google won't be supplying full access to the Android apps is going to have the most profound effect, because that's what makes so much of the functionality of a phone. You've got the camera, you've got some hardware features that are also important, but it's that functionality. So that'll have an effect, and of course it's the overall supply chain effect. You have a number of critical component suppliers from the US, Qualcomm, Intel, ST Micro, Broadcom, which technically is Singaporean owned but US operated. And it's that range of key components that are now on the chopping block of supply to Huawei that could have a big effect on Huawei's ability to build its products.
One more follow-up question on the preemptive strike by the U.S. government on Huawei. Robert, while Huawei replied with a tweet asserting that the ban would cost the U.S. thousands of jobs, one of the Chinese affiliates, the chip-making subsidiary HiSilicon, or HiSilicon, brushed aside concerns of economic impact. HiSilicon President He Tingbo said the company has backup plans to develop its own substitutes. Nevertheless, Robert, some wonder whether the U.S. ban might cripple Huawei, as similar actions against ZTE did. Are those fears unfounded?
Yeah, I think there is reason to be concerned exactly because of what you mentioned with ZTE. And China has been making very big efforts to try to build up its domestic semiconductor supply base, and it has advanced in that. But at the same time, as its electronics manufacturing base overall expands, it continues to need advanced products. And so its semiconductor import dependency ratio is actually about 70%. Now, that's not 100% from U.S. suppliers, but that's a big chunk of it. In fact, it's interesting. Semiconductors is one of the few areas where the U.S. enjoys a good surplus with China. So I'm afraid that it could be very dire. I guess the element of hope from Huawei's perspective is that I agree with the earlier comments that Trump is ultimately a deal maker. So it's not to say this is absolute. We are still awaiting details, and definitely if there's some progress on trade negotiations or cybersecurity, as I think is a bigger underlying issue here, then I think he could say, all right, we'll, just like he did with ZTE, relinquish that threat of an absolute export ban.
Thank you so much. Robert Kapp, Director of the Economist Corporate Network. Also on the panel are Mr. Thomas Patrick Gale, a Beijing-based lawyer, and Mr. Zhao Hai with the CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We've been discussing the prospects of U.S. trade standoff. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thomas, does it come as a surprise that the Republicans and Democrats are finally on the same page on one issue, China bashing? Do you think this is an important part of domestic politics? Does it have a lot to do with the general election 1 year from now?
Well, first I want to thank China for bringing our country together so our Democrats and Republicans could finally have an issue to focus on. But I think that the important thing with the combination of opinions that China's bad is to a certain extent a compliment to China because it shows that they've grown now, that they're a large enough influence, economic influence, potentially military influence in the world to be taken seriously. 20 years ago, obviously, that wouldn't happen. Right now, the Democrats and Republicans wouldn't band against Uganda as a threat to the United States. So it's shown that China has reached its towards its maturity to be able to be taken very seriously on the world front. I think that the concept that there have been problems with China are held by both parties, and I think that will continue regardless of who's in office. I think the Democrats would have a different policy and procedure in how they would move forward, but we'll have to wait to see how that unfolds over the next 6 months.
Zhao, is it true that the people like you in the academic circles were not caught and prepared by the launch of a trade standoff between the two biggest economies? Because as early back as in, maybe the financial meltdown in 2008, the American government was actually aware of the rapid growth and economic expansion of the Chinese might. They were already preparing for this showdown between Washington and Beijing, and therefore I'd like you to have a brief analysis on the evolution of the current trade standoff.
Well, first of all, I want to answer one thing before, because you talk about, Tom talked about a bilateral agreement on how to see China as a threat. Precisely because of that, I think even though Trump is a businessman, he cannot at least decide everything at this point. So there will be hotliners, people around him that could or would stop him even before he reached a deal. So I think now it's getting harder to show his art of the deal and reach the deal with China. Sure. And then going back to your question, Yang Rui, that from about 10 years ago already, China's economic strength is growing. However, that doesn't constitute a existential threat, for instance. And then later on, add to that, there's geopolitical concerns. And then there's larger strategic concerns like cybersecurity, space security. So I think there's a cumulative effect. And that has shown at the end of Obama's administration, there's a tipping point discussion in the American academic circle. And by then, we know that there will be some kind of future more tough stance against China in the U.S. Political circle. So I think it's not entirely surprising to us, but what's surprised to us is Trump's tactic, and particularly his choice of weaponry, for instance, tariff and this maximum pressure, instead of coming to China and try to at least find some common ground and to have some constructive talks about our differences. So I think probably Democrats will have a very different tactic, but not necessarily a different strategic goal. Sure. But at the end of the day, hopefully that both sides, in particular American side, would find some reason.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Robert Kapp. Robert, people like Dr. Zhao Hai from CAS may not be so surprised about the evolution of a U.S.-China relationship, but majority of the Chinese have been caught and prepared by this face-off, a very dramatic face-off between the two countries. What do you make of the evolution of this most consequential bilateral relationship? Very quickly, can you give us a broad picture?
Well, I think it is interesting. Some previous comments mentioned how, at least from Donald Trump's perspective, he considers himself friends with President Xi Jinping. I don't know if President Xi Jinping considers himself such a great friend of President Donald Trump, but anyway, the Trump-Xi relationship from the U.S. president's mindset is very friendly. And that's unique. We haven't had that in the past with any U.S. president and Chinese president. But on the other hand, we've also never had a U.S. president who has so much up front confronted China on this trade relationship and gone from tariffs of, it was first 34 billion, then another 16 billion, then another 200 billion, and now we're talking about over 300 billion. So tariffing everything. And that is truly new. And I don't think anyone predicted that. It was very hard to read that into that being part of Trump's agenda. We did know he was going to be tough on China. We didn't think it'd be that tough, especially given this purported very positive, friendly relationship between the two presidents.
There's still a lot of unpredictability about this bilateral relationship. Let's look at domestic politics in the United States, Robert. With the prospects of Democrats winning the next election, not a zero possibility, what do you think of a possible change in the China policy? Do you think Democrats would adopt a different path?
Actually, I don't. I think they would certainly tone down the rhetoric. Trump is very unique for his tweets and his belligerent statements. But I don't think there would be much deviation just because suddenly Trump has kind of rewritten the script. He totally reformed the Republican Party in his image, and he's now also reformed the role of the president in bilateral trade relations. And I think the Democrats are kind of standing back in awe of the impact it's having, and I don't think they want to deviate from that. Maybe something will change between now and a future U.S. presidency, but currently I don't see any big momentum to deviate from that.
Thank you very much, Robert. Zhao, almost all of the policy documents concerning Taiwan were approved unanimously by the two sides across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. Some of the assumptions in Chinese mainland say, unless and until Democrats take the White House, waters across the Taiwan Strait would remain pretty quiet, although quiet water runs deep. What do you think of, say, the turbulence that might be abused by the hawks in the Pentagon to create more friction and tensions between the two sides? Because Taiwan might be a nuclear suitcase between the two sides. It might not be called an exaggeration to compare Taiwan to a nuclear suitcase, right?
Taiwan issue is the most serious, most dangerous issue between China and the U.S., and that's China's red line, bottom line. So I think the U.S., whenever talking about Taiwan or having legislation about Taiwan, they should really consider the consequences about violating China's sovereignty. However, I think you can't judge Americans' foreign policy by a single piece of legislation coming out of the Congress, particularly at this moment, the House, dominated by the Democrats. If a resolution passed by this, 414 versus 0, that means probably that legislation has no teeth, because otherwise it will have a lot of internal argument, delayed process. This legislation actually started, I think, in early April and passed on May 8th, very quickly. So that means there's a very strong consensus on the U.S. side trying to show their support of Taiwan. So there are two factors here. Number one is Taiwan domestic politics, the competing between the two sides for the next presidency. They are trying to influence American domestic politics and trying to get a piece of documents from the U.S. to support Tsai Ing-wen, probably domestically. And then on the other side, the Americans are eager to sell more weapons to Taiwan and using Taiwan as a card, as a sort of bargaining chip against China. So I think both sides trying to use each other, and both sides want to pressure China on this issue. On the one hand, we take that very seriously, but on the other hand, I think at this point, this cross-Taiwan Strait issue can be managed and should be managed successfully between the two sides, and at least we shouldn't let it to become bigger and more challenging between the two sides, because we have already have a lot of problems between our countries.
Thomas, let me bring you guys back from the hair-raising prospects of having war across the Taiwan Straits between the two militaries. Let's look at the immediate response from Wall Street, the stock markets, towards Huawei and perhaps escalation of tensions because of the collapse of the latest round of trade talks, the 11th. of its kind in Washington, D.C. So what do you make of complaints by American farmers? Do you think more jobs would be endangered, up to 1 million would be lost if trade standoff between the two sides were to continue?
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the major products that China does import from the United States are soybeans and other commodities that come from the Farm Belt. That is a community that did support Donald Trump and got him elected. So I'm not sure what their feelings are right now, because it is causing severe hardships and bankruptcies, foreclosures, loss of job throughout the region. So I think that as China and the United States continue to dance on the larger level, they don't always look at the microcosm of direct impact it has on real people in China and in the United States. I'm seeing a little of the reverse also. I was at the Canton Trade Fair a few weeks ago and noticed a lot of the manufacturers are now advertising that they are setting up factories in tariff-free countries so that they can maintain the orders, but it's a loss of Chinese jobs. So now the tariffs are having an indirect impact that that the Chinese manufacturers are actually leaving China and doing manufacturing somewhere else to supply the U.S. market.
The final question goes to Robert Gabb. Are you still with us? Robert,
Yes.
What do you think of the losses of jobs as a result of the trade war? What do you think of complaints of the AmCham and business community, which used to defend the U.S.-China relationship, but they are pretty quiet at this moment?
Well, I think they also feel there needs to be a more reciprocal trade agreement, basically. So that would be consistent with their past comments. I think they're seeing how tough Trump is, and they're not wanting to get in the middle of that. But they seem to be very much endorsing the general direction of things, and they're hoping there'll be some change for China. We could debate further what that change should be and if tariffs are the right way to do it, but I think that's why they're not being vociferous against tariffs right now.
Thank you very much, Robert, for being with us. Zhao, what do you make of the U.S. business community? Do you think they will continue to be quiet and supportive of the anti-China trade policy?
Well, because the U.S. economy seems to be very strong at this moment, I think both politicians from the other side, like Democrats and U.S. business community, has no strong reason. And of course, as previously mentioned, they also want to get concessions from the Chinese side. That's why they're keeping quiet and being silent. But I think when the tariff is added and when the economy is getting having a turn, the voice will be heard.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.